Okay, tonight, for those who have been following in your books, 1 second. Oh, yes, my wife wanted to remind me, very important, that in Rachel?
Yes, Daled Tevet.
In Daled Tevet, meaning in another few days, is my wife's father's yahrzeit. His name is Yehuda Lev ben Shlomo HaKohen. And so this whole week, we're going to dedicate our shiurim to his memory. He passed away right after Hanukkah, So this is dedicated for an aliyat neshama to Yehuda Lev ben Shlomo HaKohen. This holiday is all about the Kohanim, Okay, so today we're going to be learning chapter 12. We're going to do one chapter tonight. And then next week, we're going to be finishing, we're going to do two, and we're going to finish the first section of the book of letters. So many of you have been following since the beginning. So tonight we're going to talk about final letters. Talk about the final letters. So first of all, I just want to hold this up so everyone can see. There are 5 letters that have 2 forms. One is how the letter appears in the middle of the word, and this is how the letter appears at the end of a word. The same with all of them. And we have here what's called mansapach. Mem, nun, tzadi, pei, and chaf all have 2 forms. So tonight we're going to be learning about the final forms of these 5 letters. So first of all, there's a very interesting discussion in the tractate of Megillah, page 3a. And the question is, where did these forms come from? At what point did we start using these 5 letters, if they appear at the end of the word, a different form? So I just want to point out a very important thing. The Talmud is an incredibly honest document. It does not try to paper over disagreements, and it doesn't paper over when there's an unsurety about any particular subject. So this is an amazing fact in of itself, is that our tradition, if you go back to Avram Avinu, is approximately 3,700 years old. For 1,500 of those years, 1,900 of those years, the tradition was all oral. It only began to be written down, other than the written Torah, at the time of the Mishnah, which is 200 CE. So for 1,900 years, the tradition was handed down orally. Now, you can imagine what's called broken telephone, that sometimes there is a broken telephone. And the sages are aware of this. And so sometimes different traditions are brought. So when we get to the final letters, there's a little bit of an unsurety as to at what point did these final letters come into being and their usage. So in the 3rd page of Megillah, there's a discussion. And the first statement is that the prophets established these 5 final letters at the end of the word would have a different form. But the sages question this, and they bring a verse that says that these are the commandments. And from this, the sages learned that these are the commandments that in later generations, even the prophets did not have the right to add things to the Torah. Now we have lots of what are called fences around the Torah, or a lot of customs, but the basic written Torah cannot be added to or subtracted from. So how can you say the prophets decided that these letters would have a final form? What right did they have to innovate this? So there's a discussion, and the answer, it's don't read it that they established this, they re-established. And apparently, at one point, these two forms were used interchangeable. Could be in the middle of the word or the end of the word. But the prophets came and said that when these 5 letters appear at the end of the word, they'll have a final letter. Now, what's interesting that in a different place in the Gemara, that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, they make some comments about the meaning of these letters. We're going to be going into the meaning of the letters, but mostly the usage of the letters. But what is still really a question is why these 5 letters and not 5 other letters? And that the Gemara actually doesn't elucidate why these 5 letters. Now we're going to learn something about them that will show certain commonality to these letters. But that, in a sense, is a bit of a mystery. Why these 5 letters and not 5 other letters that appear at the end of the word? Why don't they have a final form? Okay, so having said that, we're going to go through different usages of these final letters and different things that we can learn from them. So the first one we'll learn is the first statement or commandment that God gave to Abraham was Lech Lecha, go for yourself, go out of your birthplace, go out of your land, your birthplace, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. El ha'oretz asher areka, to the land I will show you. So this is a Torah from the Netivat Shalom, one of the Slonomer Rabbis, and he said like this: Areka, I will show you. Usually, when you have a final letter, one of these 5 final letters in Gematria, in Jewish numerology, we count it the same as if the letter appears in the middle of the word. So here, this word I will show you is an Aleph, Resh, Aleph, Chaf, Sofit, a final Chaf. But there's also a tradition that when the final letters appear at the end of the word, they have a different gematria. So here, the Netivat Shalom points out that when a chaf appears at the end of a word, it doesn't equal 20, like the usual chaf, it equals 500. So he said, so if you now read this word, areka, Aleph is 1, Resh is 200, Aleph is 1, and Chaf is 500. So that equals 702, equals Shabbat. So the Slonomer Rebbe said a beautiful Torah. This applies to everyone. When God said to Avram, go out of your birthplace, go out of your land, go out of your birthplace, go out of your father's house to the land I will show you. So here it's hinting the land that I will show you is the land of Shabbat, not a physical land. It's the day or even the dimension of Shabbat. So how do we enter into Shabbat? How does Avram enter into the Holy Land? You can only enter into the Holy Land if you leave behind the land that you come from and all of your preconceived notions and your rote and routine. So in other words, that's why we say, in a certain sense, even in Israel, the exile continues until we have Mashiach, until we have a temple. We're still in exile, even though we're in the land of Israel. We have 1 foot in redemption and 1 foot in exile. But how do we go into Shabbat? If you take everything from the week with you and you try to go into Shabbat, a person could be keeping all the laws of Shabbat, but their mind is still in the week. Their speech might still be in the week. So here, when it says, leave your land, leave your father's house, leave your birthplace, and go to the land I will show you. So the Netivat Shalom says that's the way to get into Shabbat. You have to, in a sense, leave the week behind, leave your problems behind, leave your unfinished business behind in order to step into the holy land of Shabbat. So this is our first example of taking one of the final letters and, in a sense, by changing its numerical value, seeing a whole different dimension. Okay, so now we're going to look at 2 of the letters. We're going to look at a nun and a tzadi. Okay, so I want to show everyone again what the nun looks like when it's the regular nun, and this is when it's a final nun. So the Gemara, in explaining this, says this is a bent over nun. You see how it's bent over? And this is called a simple straight nun. Now, I'm going to show you now the tzadi. So the tzadi, if you'll notice, this is actually a nun, also bending over, but even bending over even further. This is a yud that is engraved into the nun. And this is the final nun. And again, this is called the bent over tzadi, and this is called the straight tzadi. So what's the connection between these 2 letters? So first of all, in the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu is called Eved Ne'aman, the faithful servant. God calls Moshe, my faithful servant. And the word faithful in Hebrew begins with a nun, a regular nun, and ends with the final nun, Ne'eman. Eved Ne'eman. So it has both nuns. And if you look at the tzaddik, so again, the tzaddik is even a more bent over nun. So what does this bent over nun represent? The idea of humbleness. Remember, Moshe was called the most humble person on the face of the earth. And what is a tzaddik? A righteous person? A righteous person is one who completely humbles themselves before the will of God. So here we see a very deep connection between the nun and how it appears in the letter tzadi. Now, most people call the letter tzadi, tzadi daled yud. The Arizal called the letter tzaddik. He actually called the letter tzaddik because the letter, the form of the letter so much represents exactly what a tzaddik is. The one who is bent over. Now, we're going to see a deeper connection with this nun in a minute. But one of the explanations is the regular nun and the regular tzaddik, that's in this world. If a person humbles themselves before God and realizes the point of the righteous one in themselves, then the final letter represents the world to come. So I want to point out again something that we could see. If you look at these 5 letters, 4 of them go below the line. You see this, how the nun goes down, the tzadi goes down, the pei goes down, and the chaf goes down. Only the final mem stays on the same line as the regular. So this represents this idea of drawing down into this world, and drawing down so much that it becomes a connection to the world to come. So we see this particularly in the nun and the tzadi, because again, the nun is connected to the tzaddik in the form of the nun. So when one is faithful, so they draw down. So again, we begin with a regular nun, and then the long nun, ne'eman. So we draw down this energy, and drawing down is this idea of bending over, of humbling oneself. Like, for example, like we bend in the Amida. When we pray, I think we did this last week, or maybe it was a Tuesday class, that we talked about that during the standing prayer, the Amida, we actually bow 7 times. We bend our knee 7 times. Okay, so now we're going to take this nun and see a whole kind of story develop. In the book of Bamidbar, for those who are following, this is going to be on page 114. 114 and 115. So there, the laws of inheritance are given over. And when they're first given over, it's all male inheritance. So what happens is 5 daughters of Selofchad come to Moshe and they say, our father has no sons. Why shouldn't we inherit? And this is one of the things, we're not going to be able to get into this tonight, but if you look on page 122, these 5 letters represent 5 different questions that Moshe couldn't answer for himself. 4 of them, he turned to God and said, people have come to me, I don't know the answer. And God gave him the answer. And one of them, another person gave him the answer. So this is a fascinating thing. Maybe if we have time, we'll get to it. I don't know. But each of the 5 letters, final letters, represents one of these cases. One of these cases is the story I'm about to tell. These are the 5 daughters of Selofchad who came and asked, why shouldn't we inherit? Moshe didn't know what to tell them. So he turned to God. But in the Torah, it says he took their mishpatan, their judgment. because they were asking a question. They wanted, what is the law? What's the Jewish law? What's the judgment? And in Hebrew, it's mishpatan. He took their mishpatan in the Torah, and it ends with a final nun. Now, in the Torah, this final nun is actually a big letter. This is very, very unusual to have a final letter as the, it's not the only one, but it's big. So it really sticks out in the Torah, this big final nun. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this? So first of all, one of the ideas that are given over about these 5 letters is they all stand for judgment. Again, this is connected to these 5 questions that Moshe didn't know how to answer, the judgment. What is the law? So these 5 letters, each of the letters represents one of the questions. So they all have to do with judgment. But here, this is a big nun. So this is like the primary one. So first of all, we're told that there were 5 daughters. And so we're told that these 5 daughters, this is very symbolic, represent these 5 final letters, these 5 judgments. And so if you take, there's a concept in Kabbalah, it's shown in many, many different places. If you take any number and you multiply it by 10, that's like the full manifestation of that original number. So if you take this idea of these 5 letters and the 5 daughters of Tzelofchad, and 5 times 10 is 50. Well, 50 is the numerical value of nun, this big nun. So we're just tying these different ideas together. So there's a question that where did the daughters of Tzelofchad get, we'll call it holy chutzpah. Where did they get the nerve or the strength or the initiative to go to Moshe and say, well, what about us? The Torah already gave over the laws of inheritance, but they, in a sense, saw a problem with it, a loophole. And so they came to Moshe, and very respectfully, they put forth their case, their mishpatan, and Moshe said, fine, I'll ask God. And God said, they're right. They're right. Their claim is that they deserve an inheritance in the land of Israel, and they are correct. So the question is, again, where did they get the strength to do this? So we see a very, very fascinating idea connected with this big nun. In the previous parsha, so this is the whole story that after Bilam was the magician that the king Balak hired to try to curse the Jews. Bilam was considered a very, very powerful spiritual figure on the other side, the side of darkness. So he was considered, in a sense, the balance to Moshe Rabbeinu. And he tried to curse the Jews, and he didn't succeed. God didn't allow him to curse the Jews. So he came up with another strategy. Let's get the Jews to curse themselves. And they set up what we will call a very like an orgy kind of scene, where the daughters of these nations of Midian and Moab came to entice the Jewish men, and they were succeeding. And even one of the princes of the tribe of Shimon, Zimri, he challenged Moshe, and he very publicly took one of the princesses of these nations and had relations with her. And this is one of the 5 things also that Moshe, he didn't know what to do. All the elders had no idea what to do. And then Pinchas came and reminded them of what the halacha in such a case is. And so Moshe said, well, you thought of it, you carry out the judgment. And so Pinchas killed them. He killed Zimri and Cosby, and a plague had started in the camp, and thousands of people were dying. And as soon as Pinchas did what he did, the plague stopped. And so in the Torah, we'll get to that. No, that's the whole thing. I have to answer this now. Someone said, isn't that murder? But we're told that in a case like this, where someone publicly engages in this kind of action, in addition, there was idol worship contained in this whole orgy, that the court would allow a person to put an end to it on the spot. It's hard for us to understand this today, but that was the halacha at that time, the strict halacha. It actually saved Am Yisrael because the plague was spreading throughout the whole camp. Bilam was right. I'll just get the Jews to curse themselves. And he was succeeding. And so anyone who has my book, Orchards of Lights, I deal extensively how can God gave Pinchas a covenant of peace. So the obvious question is, how can someone merit a covenant of peace by killing someone? So this is a tremendous paradox. It's almost oxymoronic. So there's a lot to say here, but let's go back to the idea here. So in the Torah, how did Pinchas kill these 2 people? It said he took a romach. A romach is a spear. And this word, it only appears one time in the 5 books of Moses in the Chumash. And its numerical value is 248. Now, 248, we're told, are the number of limbs, bones in the body. And it's also the number of positive mitzvot. So we're told that this word for this spear represents Pinchas had to be completely Mesirat Nefesh. He had to put his whole being into doing what he had to do. And it took his entire being, as if he put his whole body and all of the positive mitzvot into doing what he did. So that here, this romach is, the spear looks like a final nun. This is the point I want to get to. It's a spear, and that's what the final nun looks like. Let's look at the nun again. The nun is just a final, like a spear. So this happens right before the daughters of Zelophehad come before Moshe. And Pinchas also, he came before Moshe and he said, Rabbi, didn't you teach us in a case like this that this is the law? And he did it very respectfully. And Moshe said, you're right. You're right. So here we see this is a drasha. We see, where did the daughters of Zelophehad get the strength, the encouragement to bring their judgment before Moshe? So we could say that's why the Nun is big in the Torah. It looks just like the spear of Pinchas. And just like he came very respectfully, but forcefully before Moshe, so did the daughters of Zelophehad. So this is have to put a lot of things together here. But just because it was brought up, and I don't want anyone to have a wrong impression. This idea is like, wasn't it murder what Pinchas did? So the example that we'll bring, how can someone deserve a covenant of peace? By killing someone. Like I said, it's very paradoxical. So let's just take an example from personal relationships and the world. Sometimes when you have an aggressor, you can try to negotiate. Let's say between nations. And unfortunately, this has happened throughout history. Let's say you have a nation that is aggressive, that attacks, that knows no red lines. What do? So the only thing you can do is to defend yourself and to be victorious. Now, what we can see is after World War II, and I'm just taking the example of the United States. The United States eventually entered the war. It was attacked by Japan, and it entered the European war. Who became like two of the best friends of America after the war to this day? Germany and Japan. In other words, as paradoxical as it sounds, sometimes the only way to make peace is to go to war. Now, Israel faces this every day. Israel wants nothing more than to be at peace with all of its neighbors. But the only way, and I think we see this very recently with what's called the Abraham Accords. If Israel was weak, there would be no Abraham Accords. The only way that Israel will ever make peace with its neighbors is when its neighbors understand that Israel not only can't be defeated, but that Israel has something that they could use, and that peace is a positive thing. So here we have, it is oxymoronic, that within a few years after World War II, with all of the suffering and all the people who died, America helped resurrect Germany and Japan, and they became allies to this day. That was the only way to make peace, was actually America had to go to war and defeat them in order to make peace. Now, this isn't the ideal, and that's why in the Torah, in the word shalom, the covenant of peace, the vav in the word shalom is broken in half. It's the only letter in the Torah that it's actually, there's a white space in the middle of the vav. It's called a vav katia. Usually, if you would have a letter in the Torah where there's something seemingly missing in the Torah, the entire Torah would become pasul, you could not read it publicly. This letter has a white space in the middle of it. to indicate that even though sometimes, let's say on a personal level, now we're not talking about killing here, chas v'shalom, but let's say two people, one is incredibly aggressive, knows no boundaries, is abusive, and maybe violent. So the only way sometimes to respond is to say, here's the red line. You can't go over this red line. You cannot violate me in this way, either through speech or physically. And then there's a chance of maybe working out the relationship. But as long as there's no boundaries and a person feels that they can do whatever they want with no pushback, no result, you can't get to peace. So the fact that this vav is broken in the middle is saying that even though sometimes the only way to get to peace is through the opposite of peace, that's not the ideal. The Torah is telling us very clearly that's not the ideal. That someday we will get to peace through peace. And let's hope we all merit to that. Okay, so let's go back to the final letters. So I just want to point out one other thing. Remember, the tzadi, remember, is a nun really bent over. Now, if you remember in the prayer Ashrei, Ashrei is an acrostic, and it goes by the Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. Each verse begins with one of the letters. When it comes to Nun, the Nun is missing. And everyone asks, why didn't David HaMelech start a verse with Nun? Because Nun represents falling. The word in Hebrew to fall is nofel, beginning with a Nun. The final Nun is, like we said, ne'aman. It straightens out and draws down the energy, but that is created by the humbleness of the regular nun. So, in a sense, the nun has its tikkun. The final nun is like the tikkun for the idea of falling. It goes below the line, but in a rectified manner. And so I just want to point out that, in a sense, it's the tikkun. So the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad represent a lot more than just these 5 daughters in the desert. They represent what's called tikkun Chava, the rectification of Chava, that from the time of the Garden of Eden, so because the sin was first through Eve, and then she gave to Adam, so she initiated this fall. And in the measure for her action, so the status of women fell, not because the Torah wanted it to fall, and not because God wanted it to fall, but the result of that sin was, in a sense, the fall of the stature of women. We see this throughout all of history in virtually every culture. But we're told that before Mashiach comes, one of the main fixings is what's called tikkun chava, that the status of women needs to be rectified. And we see it in the world today. We believe strongly that we are approaching the Messianic era. And it's not a coincidence that the status of women all over the world has changed dramatically in the last 120 years, dramatically. And this is part of a very important tikkun. So these 5 daughters of Tzlofchad, who represent these 5 final letters, that these 5 final letters represent a tikkun that will happen before Mashiach comes. So that is going to be the next final letter that we're going to discuss. And that you'll find on page 117, those who are following. And I'm going to read from the book of Isaiah, because there is a one-time phenomenon that a final letter appears in the middle of a word. Because we've been saying a final letter always comes at the end of the word. But there's one time that a final letter comes in the middle of a word. So I'm going to read in English the whole verse, and then we'll go back and understand this final letter. So this is from the 9th chapter of Isaiah, the 5th and 6th verse. So it says, "For a child has been born to us, a son given to us, and the authority is upon his shoulder." I just want to point out, this is a description of the future Redeemer of Mashiach. As we know that the book of Isaiah has many, many references to the Messianic era and to the figure of the Messiah. So here, I'll start again. "For a child has been born to us, a son given to us, and the authority is upon his shoulder. And the wondrous advisor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, called his name the Prince of Peace, Sar Shalom. To him who increases authority and for peace without end, on David's throne and on his kingdom, to establish it and to support it with justice and with righteousness from now to eternity. The zeal of the God of hosts shall accomplish this." So in these 2 verses is, whoa, it is telling us so much about this messianic figure. But in the word where it says, "to him who increases authority," the word is lemarbeh. The mem in this word is a final mem, even though it comes in the middle of the word. Lemarbeh. So this is like a once in the Bible phenomenon. Now, if you look at the word Mashiach, Mashiach begins with a mem. So that's already a hint to this idea of Mashiach. But everything I read is that this Redeemer will have the authority in which to bring peace to the world. Not that he'll just teach about peace, he'll represent peace, he'll be infused with peace. He will have the authority. That's why this letter comes in this word, because it's anytime a letter like this sticks out, it's like, whoa, look at what this is telling us. That this figure, this Redeemer, will have the authority to bring peace to the world. Meaning people will listen to him. He'll have an effect. He'll be able to accomplish bringing peace to the world. And here, of course, it says that he'll sit on David's throne. That's where we get this idea of, not just here, but Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son of David. And of course, he'll rule with justice and righteousness. And at the end, God promises that he will achieve this. This will be achieved. This prophecy is not just a hope and a wish. God is saying it will be established. It will be accomplished. So here we have a mem in the middle of the word, a final mem. So the Tikkunei Zohar comments about this mem. And there are many, many secrets that are given over. One of them is, and let me show you 1 second. The first letter of the Torah, of course, is a bet. And you see that it is closed on 3 sides, but open to 1 side. Now, in a certain way, you can look at this as 3 vavs. 3 vavs. Now, if you took another line here and you put it here, you would have a final mem. That's what it's missing. You'd have a final mem. So what is being alluded to here? What is being alluded to here? We're told in the first verse of the Torah, the letter Aleph, appears 6 times. Aleph has many, many different meanings, what Aleph means. One of them is Elef, 1,000. From the fact that there are 6 Alephs, we're going to get to this actually later in the book. There's 6 Alephs represent 6,000 years. So the Torah is already telling us in the first verse that this cycle of history will last for 6,000 years. The 7,000th year is the Messianic era. Now, in the Jewish calendar now, we're at 5782. That means we are getting very close to 6,000 years. And according to many, many people, this is why there is a state of Israel now. This is why 120, 130 years ago, Jews started coming back to Israel. As we approach the 6,000 years, we are approaching the Messianic era. And the Messianic era is dependent on the return of the Jewish people to the Holy Land. So when you take the bet of Bereshit and you close it, it becomes this closed mem, which represents that the Mashiach will come and close the 6,000 years of history and pave the way for a brand new era called the Messianic era. So that's a very, very deep understanding of this mem. Now, since we're talking about this, I just want to add something very, very beautiful, that on Rosh Hashanah, and I'm mentioning this because this is the 8th day of Hanukkah, and we're told that the judgment that begins on Rosh Hashanah in a certain way comes to its conclusion during Hanukkah. And one of the like parables that are given over, or metaphors, is that let's say the judgment of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and up to Hoshana Rabbah. So it's sealed, but it's only the sentence is only read at Hanukkah time. It's as if we open up the letter, and it's like in a court case. Let's say the jury decides so-and-so is guilty. Well, what happens then? The court is adjourned until sentencing. And then a week later, a day later, a month later, it's reconvened and the judge hands down the sentence. Well, between the decision and the sentencing, a lot of things can happen. A lot of things can happen. New evidence could come up. There could be an appeal. There's a revolution in the country, and everything goes haywire, all kinds of things can happen. So we're told that Hanukkah, by the lights of Hanukkah, it becomes clear to us what our judgment is. And of course, we have the power to change that judgment. We have the power to influence that judgment. So I'm mentioning this because on Rosh Hashanah, we do a ritual called Tashlich, where after davening almost all day, we go to a body of water and we put some breadcrumbs in our pocket, and we symbolically throw the breadcrumbs, which are our sins, into the water, and it's preferably a flowing water, a stream or a river, and they're taken away, they're cleansed. It's a beautiful ritual. We say the 13 midot of Rachamim in the book of Micha. Very, very beautiful ritual. Like whole congregations go out to bodies of water. There's many, many other meanings. Water purifies. But one of the interesting things is in Rosh Hashanah, one of the main themes of Rosh Hashanah is coronating God King. If you look at the prayers, it's actually much more about coronating God King, accepting God as King of the universe. Like we do 100 times a day, we make 100 blessings a day. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu, Melech haolam. Blessed are you, O God, King of the universe. 100 times a day. So what's interesting is, in ancient times, how was a king coronated? At a body of water. Why? Because it represents, just like water flows, and it just flows into the sea, flows forever. A king, the blessing is that the king and those who inherit from him will receive the kingship forever. So it's Mashiach ben David. To this day, it's still the same lineage. Mashiach ben David. Now, the beautiful thing, the reason I'm mentioning this, is we're talking about the mem. And the whole thing is to go to a body of water. So when you take the numerical value of water, mayim, mem is 40, yud is 10, and mem is 40, equals 90. The gematria of melech. The gematria of melech is king. So where do you go to coronate the king? To a body of water. And so the open mem represents flowing water. And the final mem, see in the open mem, there's an opening here. This is like water flowing in and out. This is like a closed body of water. And that's why the word for the ritual bath is mikvah. It begins with a mem. It's the place of the gathering of the waters. So on the 8th day of Hanukkah, we're praying that the light goes out to the whole world. The whole world needs so much light now. We need Mashiach, we need redemption, and we need redemption for the whole world. So Bezrat Hashem, the final mem, the bet of Bereshit, will be closed, and it will be a body of water that will purify us, and that Mashiach will come soon, and we'll all merit to it.